Drew here, and I think that Dark Winds on AMC and AMC Plus, I think it's a nice little series that if you're at all interested in, you should definitely check out. I was wondering when this was announced, why on earth George R. R. Martin was producing, and having read an article in the Hollywood Reporter, turns out he had at least an acquaintanceship with the author of the books that this series is based on, Tony Hillerman, and that they felt that, maybe bringing him on board to kind of guide this series to the small screen would, be the way to go. Now, obviously, I don't think it hurt that George R. R. Martin has such high name recognition with Game of Thrones, even though this is such a drastically different series for the most part. It's had a long journey to the small screen, apparently. Robert Redford's been trying to get a film adaptation of it made since the 80s when he first discovered these books. And that's an interesting aspect of this, because if you started watching this series and didn't realize it was based on novels that started being written in the 1970s and went on, past that, but started in the 70s, you might think that the fact that this story takes place on the Navajo reservation in 1971 is something of a nostalgia ploy, because, nostalgia is really, really big right now. But no, I think that honestly that they had to set it then, because that's when the stories that Hillerman wrote took place, and that was when he wrote them. And I think that there's a lot of aspects of it that just wouldn't work if they took place in 2022. I'm not saying that none of the problems, none of the harsh realities facing Native Americans on the reservation that they're all gone. I'm not saying that, but I am saying situations have changed. And I think from a procedural standpoint, I think as a mystery thriller, there's a lot of things that wouldn't work if people had iPhones, for example. The isolation that people are able to experience on the reservation, it kind of creates a lot of neo-Western situations. And they definitely use a lot of the imagery from old Westerns, and they repurpose it for the Native American heroes of this story. And I think it works really well. I think that the thing is that this would work really well if it was just a mystery thriller. There's a lot of simple pleasures here, threats of violence, tense standoffs, even actual shootouts. And I think that in the first two episodes, it's pretty clear that this being on a regular, not a network, but on a channel that has to air live, I think that's a good thing for this show, because the writers have to bear in mind that if they don't have something interesting happen every 8 minutes, then people are going to tune out. I think people get used to the Netflix model where it's just like, oh, well, we drop all the episodes, so people will just kind of have it on and they won't tune out even if we don't really explain what this show is going to be like in the first episode. But I think it's much better to have a targeted attempt to hold the audience's interest. I think there's that famous, I forget who said it, but someone, basically essentially said, if I had had more time, I would have made it shorter. Essentially getting to the heart of why I think this is a better execution strategy, because oftentimes if you have enough time, you can make anything seem good, but it takes actual talent to establish characters and setting and all these other aspects in a short amount of time. And this series does it so well. Now, it's interesting because it has about a $5 million per episode budget, which is nothing to sneeze at, obviously, but it's actually on the smaller side for where streaming fare is going. When you look at all these $20 and $30 million shows coming out. But hopefully that makes it a little bit easier for them to bring this show back for multiple seasons. There's 18 source novels to draw from. Apparently this draws from 2 different novels featuring 2 different protagonists and kind of just merges their stories together so that they can be in the same story. I was actually surprised to hear that, because I felt like everything seemed to connect pretty smoothly. It didn't feel like a disjointed story to me. But I'll give them kudos for, pulling that off, and, also elevating the role of Bernadette Manuelito, who apparently is not that prominent in this novel, but becomes more prominent in subsequent novels. So I give them kudos for that and just having a tightly constructed mystery thriller. And it would work on just that level, but I think there's a couple things buoying this story. One, I think that it's such an interesting setting. There's so many rituals established that we get to witness so much of the Navajo culture, and it's so intricate and dense with history. And the writers, to their credit, seem to have this strategy. I read some quotes where they basically stated this outright, but they seem to have this strategy of not telling the audience too much, assuming that if we're interested in some ritual or in some momentary thing that we see, that we'll go and do the research and learn more about Navajo culture for ourselves. And I think that's the right strategy, because there's enough here to give this story an edge, to make it more, impactful and interesting, but not so much that it keeps the story from moving forward. As I said, the pacing is really good. I do think that there are a few instances where it felt to me as though characters were wandering around one location and just staring at objects for too long. I know that they're trying to introduce clues and to make sure that they register with us, the audience, but I think at some level they have to realize we're probably not going to remember if you leave it on screen for longer, and also that these scenes are just kind of a little too long and drawn out, in my opinion. But mileage is definitely going to vary there. Some of you will just enjoy the landscape of the southeastern US and just enjoy getting to see these locations that they've recreated. They were going to be allowed to film on the Navajo reservation in New Mexico, apparently, but COVID-19 struck and plans changed. But so they created all these sets, I think, for the most part. And it really is a great backdrop for a series. I think that what really sets a mystery thriller series apart is the setting. That was the way it was with Mare of Easttown, and that's the way it is here. The other thing that really gives this series a boost is the performance of Zahn McClarnon as Joe Leaphorn. I think that he has constantly proven himself to be a really, really strong character actor in a lot of television roles, most notably probably in Fargo, as this villain that really stole a lot of screen time from other characters. And the question was always, what roles are going to be available to Zahn to play as a lead? It just does, because he's not the type of actor that Hollywood looks to as a lead. There's a limited range of roles for him, and he's not going to get cast in a role that wasn't specifically written for a Native American, most likely. So I hope that this series gets renewed for a lot of seasons, because I think it has potential to be really compelling, somewhat in the vein, I know this is a weird comparison, but somewhat in the vein of Justified. It also kind of evoked Hell or High Water for me. But I think that this could be a great role for him. He has such great presence, and the character is very nuanced and detailed. He's this man who has kind of a foot in both the white man's world and the world of the reservation, and he's not really accepted in either as a result. He's educated, but he came back to the reservation. And I think they've not really explicitly stated this, but I think that he kind of realizes that he has to have that foot in the white man's world in order to protect the people on the reservation from their encroachment. So really, really good character work by him. When he's on screen, I'm riveted no matter what he's doing. And I think that this character is really well written and interesting. And I'm very, very intrigued whenever he's on screen. Less so when Jim Chi, played by Kiowa Gordon, is on screen. I don't dislike this character. I think that there's a certain level of nuance in the writing here too, but I do think that the acting and just the overall amount of interest in the character is just not as high. I realize in the books they're kind of equals. Here, balance obviously leans more towards Joe. As I mentioned, they've amplified the role of Bernadette, and I actually found her more interesting, at least in these first two episodes, than Jim. I think None of these are like super effusive characters. They all seem likely introverts, but she is probably the most effusive one, and she has a deeper connection to her spiritual roots than either of the other two characters. That's something that adds an interesting dynamic. There have been tinges of supernatural elements in the first two episodes, but it's kind of unclear how seriously we're supposed to take these. Certainly the perspective of Joe seems to be that they should be treated with respect, even if you disbelieve their reality. And I think that's the approach the show is taking. So I'm really interested to see where it goes. Like I said, they kind of hit out the gate pretty fast. It feels like I'm a lot further in than 2 episodes. So I would recommend this. I would personally give it, at this point, like a 7.5. Just realize, though, I don't give anything a 10, so my 7.5, I give some things a 10, but almost nothing. So my 7.5 is more like an 8 or a 9 from someone else. But those are just my thoughts for what they are worth. Let me know what you thought in the comments. If you're interested in seeing my upcoming reviews of other shows, please consider subscribing to the channel, and as always, thank you for watching.